Lonely Rancher. Found an Apache warrior girl caged at auction for $6 Golden Valley, summer of 1872. The sun hung like fire above the plains, scorching the dirt until it cracked and curled like old parchment. Heat shimmered off the tin rooftops of the half-dead town where the air was thick with dust and sweat heavy as a blacksmith's forge. Near the grain warehouse, a crowd had gathered miners with hands rough as river rock drifters with eyes sharp as switchblades, cattlemen in sweat-stained hats, and housewives with faces tight as tanned hide. The building, once a storehouse for oats and barley, now held a darker cargo. $3.50, the auctioneer's voice cut like a whip, sharp and nasal, bouncing off the warped wooden walls of the warehouse. Jasper Stone stood just outside the general store, a coil of hemp rope in one hand, a sack of coffee beans in the other. At 32, his broad shoulders sagged under a faded denim shirt, and his weathered Stetson cast a shadow over eyes that carried the weight of a decade-old wound, his family lost in an Apache raid, their screams still echoing in his dreams. His face, lined deeper than the alkali flats, bore the mark of a man who'd buried more than he'd built. He hadn't planned to linger in Golden Valley. His only aim was to grab supplies and ride back to his lonesome ranch where silence was his only companion. But the crowd's fevered hum, a raw hunger in their voices, tugged at him like a lasso. Something stirred in his chest, not curiosity, but a restless unease like a horse scenting a storm. His boots scuffed the dusty ground as he stepped closer, the rope swinging lightly in his grip. Inside the warehouse, the source of the commotion sat in a rusted iron cage, its bars pitted with age glinting dully under the sun's glare. She was young, 19, maybe 20, her skin bronze beneath a map of bruises, her face narrow and proud, like a hawk perched defiant despite a clipped wing. Blood crusted at her temple, a dark smear against her high cheekbones, and one cheek swelled purple, a shadow blooming under her eye. Her black hair tangled as sagebrush fell across bare shoulders where a torn cotton dress clung to her lean frame. Her wrists bound with cracked leather straps rested in her lap, but her spine was straight as a rifle barrel, her dark eyes fixed forward, refusing the crowd's gaze. Matoaka, a grizzled miner, muttered nearby, his voice thick with scorn. Apache scout caught near Red Canyon. Jasper's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening around the rope, the coarse fibers biting into his palm. Her stillness wasn't surrender. It was a coiled spring, a silent rebellion that sliced through the crowd's jeers like a blade through hide. $4. The auctioneer barked, his greasy mustache twitching as sweat rolled down his brow. The sun poured through the warehouse's broken roof, casting jagged lines across Matoaka's shoulders, her skin gleaming like polished stone under the merciless light. A fly buzzed near her swollen cheek. She didn't flinch, her eyes burning with a fire that no cage could snuff out. Something in her unyielding stare struck Jasper like a spark igniting dry tinder, a defiance that echoed his own buried pain, a wound he'd never let heal. He stepped forward, without thinking, the rope and coffee sack falling to the dirt, with a soft thud, dust rising like ghosts around his boots. The crowd parted whispers, rippling like wind through dry grass. Jasper Stone's gone loco. A cattleman hissed spit and tobacco into the dirt. Jasper ignored them, his boots thudding against the packed earth as he approached the cage. His shadow fell long and lean across the bars, a dark silhouette against the sun's glare, like a lone pine standing against a wildfire. Without a word, he shrugged off his leather coat, its edges frayed from years of wind and work, and draped it gently over the cage's top, shielding Matoaka from the punishing light. Her eyes flicked to his, sharp as flint, searching, not trusting, but not hostile. For a heartbeat, their gazes locked, and Jasper saw not a captive, but a warrior caged yet unbroken, her spirit fierce as the desert wind. $5, the auctioneer shouted, squinting at Jasper through the haze. The crowd's laughter swelled a cruel edge cutting through the air. That rancher's been too long in the sun, a housewife sneered, her voice sharp as a sewing needle. Jasper reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing a small leather pouch worn soft by years of handling. He poured $5 silver into his calloused palm, their weight heavy, but one coin short. His jaw worked silently, the laughter growing louder, a chorus of mockery that stung like alkali dust. Then a hand touched his elbow, light but steady. He turned to see Can sat Truong, Silas Vance, his dusty brown coat, unbuttoned spectacles slipping down his weathered nose. Silver hair glinted under his hat, and his eyes, kind but etched with the weariness of a man who'd seen too much, held Jasper's gaze. "Don't let your conscience borrow trouble it can't repay," Silas said, low-pressing a single silver coin into Jasper's hand, its cool weight a quiet anchor. Jasper nodded, not in thanks but in understanding, his throat tight as a cinched saddle. He stepped forward, holding up the $6, the coins glinting like stars in the sunlight. "6, he called, his voice rough but steady, cutting through the crowd's murmurs like a knife through rawhide. The auctioneer blinked, then shrugged his gavel, banging against a splintered crate. "Sold to the man with the long shadow," he declared, his voice dripping with disdain. The crowd's laughter faded into uneasy whispers as a deputy fumbled with the cage's lock, the chains clattering to the ground like broken promises. Jasper crouched beside the cage, his voice low, almost a whisper, as if speaking to a spooked colt. "I'm Jasper," he said, his breath catching on the words. "I ain't here to hurt you." Matoaka's eyes met his again, calculating like a coyote sizing up a trap, her gaze a blade honed by years of survival. She didn't speak, didn't move her bound hands still in her lap, her fingers curled slightly, ready to strike or flee. Jasper offered his hand, calluses rough against the air, but she didn't take it. He stood, weight in his heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. Then, slowly, she rose, her movement stiff like a deer stepping free of a snare. The crowd watched in silence, their eyes heavy with judgment, as the rancher and the warrior girl stepped out of the warehouse, the leather coat still draped over the empty cage, a silent testament to a choice that would change them both. If this spark of defiance and compassion stirs your heart, saddle up with us at Wild West Love for more Wild West stories of redemption and romance in the untamed West. The sun dipped low over Golden Valley, painting the horizon in hues of blood and gold as Jasper Stone and Matoaka left the dust-choked town behind the creak of the wagon wheels, blending with the evening's restless wind, which carried the scent of sagebrush and distant rain. Jasper's chestnut mare, Daisy, pulled the wagon steadily, her hooves crunching the gravel-strewn trail that wound through the parched plains where mesquite trees stood like gnarled sentinels under a sky vast as an unspoken promise. Matoaka sat beside him, her body rigid, her bound wrists resting in her lap, the leather straps chafing her skin raw, her dark eyes scanning the horizon like a hawk searching for escape. Jasper's hands, calloused from years of roping cattle, gripped the reins loosely. His broad shoulders hunched under the weight of a decision he hadn't fully reckoned, with his heart pounding like a blacksmith's hammer against the silence between them. The air was heavy, not just with heat, but with the unspoken tension of two strangers bound by a single act of defiance against a town's cruelty. Matawaka's first attempt to flee came at dusk when the sky bruised purple and the trail dipped into a shallow gully fringed with cottonwoods. Without a word, she leapt from the wagon, her bare feet hitting the ground with a soft thud, her torn dress catching on a thorn bush as she sprinted toward the shadowed hills, her movements swift and silent like a deer fleeing a hunter's arrow. Jasper reined in Daisy, his breath catching not in anger but in a pang of understanding that twisted in his chest like a barbed wire. He didn't shout after her, didn't chase her with force. Instead, he tied the mare to a scrub oak and followed her trail, his boots crunching over dry grass, his eyes tracing her path through the fading light. He found her an hour later, crouched by a dry creek bed, her chest heaving, her face streaked with sweat and dust, her eyes blazing with a fire that refused to be tamed. "You'll die out here alone," he said softly, his voice rough as gravel standing a safe distance away, his hands open to show no threat. "Ain't no shame in coming back." Her gaze met his, sharp as a blade, her lips pressed tight, but something flickered in her eyes. Not trust, but a calculation, like a wolf weighing the odds of a trap. She rose slowly, her knees trembling from exhaustion, and followed him back to the wagon. Her steps uneven, her pride unbroken. The silence between them was thick as the desert air, but Jasper felt a spark of hope, fragile as a candle flame in a storm that she'd chosen to return, even if only for survival. At camp that night, under a sky studded with stars like scattered silver coins, Jasper built a small fire, its flames licking low, casting shadows across Matawaka's face, where bruises bloomed like dark flowers. He cut the leather straps from her wrists with his pocket knife, careful not to touch her skin, and offered her a tin cup of water from his canteen. "Drink," he said, his voice steady but soft like a breeze over the plains. She took the cup, her fingers brushing his for a fleeting moment, her touch wary but not hostile, and drank deeply, her throat moving with each swallow, her eyes never leaving his. The next morning, as they reached a shallow stream shaded by willows, Jasper noticed a gash on her forearm crusted with blood, the skin around it swollen and angry. He knelt by the water, soaking a clean bandana, his movements deliberate, his face etched with lines of concern that deepened in the dawn's light. "This'll sting," he warned, his voice low, almost a whisper as he reached for her arm. She tensed her muscles, coiling like a spring, but didn't pull away, her eyes locked on his, searching for intent. He cleaned the wound gently, the cold water mixing with blood, his fingers steady, despite the tremor in his heart, which beat like a drum, calling him to a purpose he hadn't known he'd lost. "You can tell me to stop," he added, pausing to meet her gaze, his eyes soft but resolute, like the horizon before a storm. She didn't speak, but her shoulders eased a fraction of tension, slipping away, her breath slowing as if she'd begun to measure the distance between fear and trust. Back in Golden Valley, their return sparked whispers that spread like wildfire through dry grass. At the town's only diner, a squat building with peeling paint and the smell of bacon grease, the owner. A wiry woman with a scowl, sharp as barbed wire, blocked their path. "She ain't eatin' here," she snapped her arms, crossed her voice, cutting through the hum of forks and plates. Jasper's jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists, but he didn't argue his silence a shield against the town's venom. Matawaka stood behind him, her chin high, her eyes scanning the room like a warrior sizing up a battlefield, her stillness a defiance louder than words. Just as they turned to leave, a soft voice called from across the street. "Over here," you two said, Mrs. Merriweather, her faded blue apron dusted with flour, her gray hair pulled into a loose bun, her eyes warm as a hearth fire. Her shop, Mary's Bread and Brew, glowed with the scent of fresh bread and molasses, its single table a haven in the storm of prejudice. They sat the wooden chairs creaking under their weight, and Mrs. Merriweather placed a bowl of stew before Matoaka, steam curling like a prayer into the air. "No one goes hungry in my place," she said, her voice firm but kind, her hands worn from years of kneading dough. Matoaka stared at the bowl, her hands trembling slightly, her lips parting as if to speak, but closing again, her eyes flickering with something memory perhaps, or disbelief at kindness unearned. She lifted the spoon, her movements slow, deliberate, and took a sip. Her eyes closing briefly, not in pleasure but in a quiet reckoning, as if tasting something lost long ago. Jasper watched, his heart tightening like a cinched saddle, ashamed of how much her small act of acceptance moved him. He looked away, his gaze settling on the window where the town's dust swirled like gossip, fast and unforgiving. "Folks'll talk," Mrs. Merriweather said, wiping her hands on her apron, her voice low but steady. "Let 'em. Truth moves slow, but it's got deeper roots than lies." Jasper knotted his throat tight, his fingers tracing the grain of the table, rough as his own resolve. Matoaka glanced at him, her eyes softer now, not trusting but recognizing, like a seed breaking through hard earth. The stew warmed her, her hands steadier with each bite, and for a moment the world outside faded, leaving only the quiet clink of her spoon and the crackle of the shop's small fire. If this tale of defiance and quiet kindness stirs your soul, join us at Wild West Love for more journeys through the heart of the West, where love blooms in the harshest of deserts. The days stretched long and lean across the Golden Valley plains, where the sun carved shadows sharp as knives into the cracked earth, and the wind whispered secrets through the sagebrush, carrying the faint tang of creosote and distant thunder. Jasper Stone's ranch, a weathered sprawl of cedar fences and sun-bleached barns, stood like a lone sentinel against the vastness, its silence broken only by the lowing of cattle and the creak of a windmill spinning lazily in the breeze. Matoaka, no longer bound by leather straps but tethered by the weight of her own wariness, moved through this new world with the grace of a panther. Her steps light but deliberate, her dark eyes scanning every horizon as if freedom might yet slip through her fingers like sand. Jasper, his broad frame, stooped from years of toil, worked beside her, his calloused hands guiding hers as he taught her to mend a fence, his voice low and steady like the hum of a river carving through stone, patient yet unyielding. Their days were filled with the rhythm of labor, roping calves, hauling water from the well stacking hay, under a sky that burned gold at dusk. But beneath the surface, a quiet current of understanding flowed fragile as a spider's web, binding them in ways neither could yet name. Matoaka's hands, once clenched in defiance, now gripped a hammer with purpose, her fingers learning the weight of nails and the give of cedar posts, her movements precise like a warrior wielding a blade. Jasper watched her from the corner of his eye, his heart stirring like embers under ash, struck by the way her narrow shoulders squared against the work, her bruised skin gleaming with sweat under the noon sun. Her face a mask of focus that hid a storm of unspoken grief. One evening, as the sky bled crimson into indigo, he led her to the edge of the ranch, where a patch of wild sage grew thick, its silver leaves catching the last light like scattered coins. "This land knows how to survive," he said, kneeling to crush a leaf between his fingers, releasing its sharp, clean scent. "You show it, care it gives back." Matoaka knelt beside him, her torn dress brushing the dirt, her eyes tracing the sage's stubborn roots. Her silence not empty, but heavy like a riverbed waiting for rain. She reached out her fingers, brushing the leaves, and murmured a word in Apache, Wa-chon-iwe. Her voice soft as a breeze, teaching him the name of the plant in her tongue. Jasper repeated it, stumbling over the syllables, and for the first time her lips twitched, not quite a smile, but a crack in her armor, fleeting as a star's reflection in a stream. Their nights were haunted by ghosts. Neither spoke of Jasper's dreams, filled with the screams of his lost family, Matoaka's, with the clash of steel and the cries of her kin. They sat by the fire, its flames dancing like restless spirits, the crackle of burning cedar filling the silence between them. One night, as the moon hung low, swollen and yellow like a warning, Matoaka's hands trembled, her eyes distant, lost in a memory that carved lines of pain across her face. Jasper didn't reach for her, didn't speak, but slid a tin mug of coffee across the rough-hewn table, its steam curling like a prayer into the chill air. She took it, her fingers wrapping around the warmth, her gaze meeting his, not with gratitude, but with recognition, like a hawk acknowledging a fellow survivor. "You carry it too," she said, her voice low, her first words to him in days sharp and clear as a bell in the desert night. Jasper nodded, his throat tight, his eyes tracing the fire's glow on her cheek where the bruise had faded but left a shadow like a map of battles fought and won. The town's venom followed them like a shadow, its whispers coiling through the streets of Golden Valley, where gossip rode faster than a stagecoach, twisting truth into tales of scandal. At the saloon, a squat building reeking of whiskey and stale tobacco trouble brewed thick as molasses. Jedediah Voss, a cattle baron with a face hard as flint, stood with his son, Rhett, and Clay Danner, a wiry miner with a temper sharp as a spur. Their eyes locked on Jasper as he entered Matoaka at his side, her chin high, embed high, her posture rigid, her hands curled at her sides ready to strike. "Well, look at this." Rhett sneered, his thumbs hooked in his belt, his voice dripping venom, the rancher and his savage. Jasper's jaw clenched, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife, his voice low and cold as a winter stream. "She ain't mine, and she ain't yours to judge," he said, stepping in front of Matoaka, his broad frame a shield. "She's free, and you'll leave her be, or you'll answer to me." Clay laughed a harsh bark, his eyes glinting like a snake's. "You think you can parade her around like some prize she's Apache stone. Blood and fire, that's all they know." Matoaka's fingers twitched, her body coiled like a spring, but Jasper's voice cut through sharp as a whip. "She's more than you'll ever be." He said his words heavy with conviction, his eyes burning with a fire that matched her own. "Touch her system and you'll find out what a real fight looks like." The saloon fell silent, the air thick with tension as Jedediah stepped forward, his heavy frame looming, his voice smooth but menacing like a rattlesnake's hiss. "You're making enemies, Stone. This ain't over." Jasper didn't flinch his hand, steady his gaze unyielding. "Good. Gives me something to look forward to." He said, his voice a low growl, a line drawn in the dust. Matoaka's eyes flicked to his, a spark of something new, respect perhaps, or the first embers of trust igniting in their depths like a fire catching in dry grass. They left the saloon under a cloud of stares, the weight of the town's judgment pressing against their backs like a storm. Outside, under a sky streaked with stars, Jasper handed Matoaka a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, his fingers brushing hers, rough but gentle. "Open it," he said, his voice soft as the night breeze. Inside was a single caramel, its wrapper worn but intact, a relic from his mother's kitchen kept for years in his saddlebag. "Ain't much," he said, his eyes fixed on the ground, his heart pounding like a stampede. But it's sweet. Helps sometimes. Matoaka unwrapped it slowly, her fingers careful, her face unreadable, like a desert canyon hiding its secrets. She placed it in her mouth, chewing slowly her shoulders, easing her eyes, softening not with joy, but with a quiet wonder, like a flower blooming in cracked earth. For a moment, their eyes met, and the silence spoke louder than words, a fragile bridge spanning the chasm between them. Back at the ranch, under the flickering glow of a lantern, Jasper sat at his table, carving a piece of cedar into a small horse. His hands steady, but his mind restless, haunted by the fire in her eyes. Matoaka stood by the window, her silhouette sharp against the moonlight, her arms across her gaze distant like a lone wolf watching the horizon. "Why?" she asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet, sharp and clear. Jasper paused, his knife still, his heart lurching like a spooked colt. "Why, what?" he replied, his voice low, rough with emotion. "Why me?" she said, turning to face him, her eyes piercing her face, a map of courage and pain. He set the carving down, his hands trembling slightly, his voice steady as stone. "Because I've seen what it's like to lose everything," he said, his eyes meeting hers raw and open like a wound laid bare. "And I couldn't let it happen to you." The night stretched on the wind, carrying the howl of a coyote, lonely but fierce, like the bond growing between them, unspoken but strong. If this tale of courage and quiet connection grips your heart, ride with us at Cowboy Love Stories, where the West's wild spirit meets the tender pulse of love, forged in fire and time. Scene 4. Flight through the night and the price of freedom. The night cloaked Golden Valley in a shroud of stars, their cold light scattering across the plains like broken promises, while the wind howled through the mesquite, carrying the sharp scent of dust and impending rain, as if the land itself sensed the storm brewing in the hearts of men. Jasper Stone and Matoaka, bound by a fragile thread of trust, woven through days of shared labor and quiet glances, faced a new peril that threatened to unravel their bond as whispers of vengeance from Jedediah Voss and his men coiled through the town like smoke from a smoldering fire. The ranch, once a haven of cedar and starlight, now felt exposed, its fences trembling under the weight of a darkness that crept closer with each passing hour. Jasper sat on the porch, his broad hands polishing a rifle, the metal gleaming like a predator's eye, his jaw set tight as a bear trap, his eyes flicking to the horizon where shadows danced like ghosts of his past. Matoaka stood inside, feeding the fire with deliberate care, her lean frame silhouetted against the flames, her movements precise as a warrior's. Her dark eyes reflecting the fire's glow, a storm of resolve and fear swirling within them, like a river churning before a flood. The knock came at midnight, sharp and urgent, splitting the silence like an axe through dry wood. Jasper rose his hand, gripping the rifle, his boots creaking against the floorboards as he opened the door to find Mrs. Merriweather, her bonnet askew, her shawl clutched tight against the chill, her face pale as moonlight, her breath ragged from a desperate run. "They're coming, Jasper," she gasped, her voice trembling like a leaf in a gale, her eyes wide with urgency. "Jedediah Rhett Clay. They've been drinking at the saloon, talking of taking Matoaka back, making an example of you both." Jasper's heart thudded a drumbeat of dread and defiance, his fingers tightening on the rifle, his broad shoulders squaring as if to bear the weight of the world. Matoaka stepped to the doorway, her hands steady, her face unreadable, but her eyes sharp as obsidian like a hawk poised for flight. "There's a cart behind my orchard. Mrs. Merriweather whispered, her voice low and fierce, her hands gripping Jasper's arm. "Old mule half blind, but she'll get you west. Go now before their torches light the trail." 10 minutes later, the cart rattled through the darkness, its wheels groaning like a wounded beast, the mule's hooves crunching gravel as they crossed the plains, the moonlight painting silver streaks across the sagebrush, which swayed like mourners at a funeral. Jasper held the reins, his knuckles white, his eyes scanning the shadows, his heart pounding like a war drum, each beat a vow to keep Matoaka safe. She sat beside him, her body coiled, her torn dress catching the wind, her hands gripping the cart's edge, her gaze fixed on the trail behind, as if she could see the hunter's eyes glinting in the dark. The night cracked open with a rifle shot sharp and sudden shatter in the silence like glass. The mule rearing with a scream, the cart lurching as a wheel caught in a rut, splintering with a sickening snap. Jasper leapt down, his boots sinking into the dirt, his hands steadying the mule, his voice low and urgent. "Off the trail now," he hissed, his eyes meeting Matoaka's, a silent pact forged in the heat of danger. They scrambled through a narrow pass between two stone bluffs, the rocks jagged as broken promises, the air thick with the scent of dust and fear, their breaths shallow as they ducked beneath overhanging thorns, their shadows merging with the night like fugitives fleeing fate. Another shot rang out closer now, the echo bouncing off the cliffs like a hunter's taunt, followed by the thunder of hooves and men's voices, sharp with rage, cursing the darkness that hid their prey. Jasper led the way, his broad frame pushing through brush, his hands bleeding from thorns, his heart, a furnace of resolve, burning bright as he guided Matoaka to a steep ridge, its slope treacherous, strewn with loose shale that shifted like betrayal underfoot. "Climb," he said, his voice steady but urgent, his eyes locking with hers, a beacon in the chaos. She hesitated, her breath ragged, her hands trembling, but her gaze held his, fierce and unyielding like a flame refusing to die. Jasper crouched, his knees sinking into the dirt, hands braced against the rock, his voice a low command. "Step on my back." Matoaka paused, her eyes searching his, not for weakness, but for truth, her fingers curling as if to anchor herself to the moment. "Do it," he urged, his voice rough as gravel, his body steady as stone despite the ache in his bones. She stepped onto his back, her boots pressing into his shoulders, her hands digging into the rock above her, movements swift and sure like a mountain cat scaling a cliff. Jasper gritted his teeth, his muscles straining his breath, hissing through clenched jaws as her weight passed over him. A burden he bore willingly, his heart swelling with a purpose that drowned out the pain. She reached the ledge, turned, and extended her hand, her fingers streaked with dirt and blood, her eyes fierce but soft, a silent vow that she'd not leave him behind. He took her hand, his grip firm, his boots slipping as he hauled himself up, their breaths mingling in the cold air, their bodies pressed close in the narrow space like two stars colliding in the night. At the summit, they collapsed against a slab of rock, their chests heaving, their eyes scanning the darkness below, where voices echoed, searching but not yet, climbing their torches, flickering like wolves' eyes in the distance. Jasper reached into his coat, his fingers brushing the crumpled paper. The bill of sale, its ink smudged Matoaka's name, misspelled, a relic of a wrong he'd never meant to commit. He held it to the moonlight, its edges frayed like his own regrets, and tore it once, twice, the pieces fluttering like ash into the abyss. "You ain't owned," he said, his voice low, heavy with conviction, his eyes meeting hers, raw and open like a wound laid bare. Not bought, not saved, just free. Matoaka's eyes glistened. Not with tears, but with something deeper, older, like a river finding its course, her hand resting lightly on his. Not in gratitude, but in recognition, a silent pact that they were in, this together two souls forged in the crucible of flight. The wind howled, carrying the promise of dawn as the distant shouts faded the hunter's resolve, breaking against the night's vastness. If this tale of courage and quiet bonds grips your heart, comment one below and ride with us at Western Stories and Wild West Stories, where love and freedom rise from the ashes of the frontier. Scene 5. A new dawn and a home. Reborn dawn spilled over Golden Valley like molten gold, painting the sagebrush and cedar fences in hues of amber, as if the land exhaled a sigh of relief after the night's chaos. The air sharp with dew and earth, a fragile promise of renewal. Jasper Stone and Matoaka, weary from their flight through jagged bluffs, returned to the ranch under a vast sky, their footsteps heavy on dew-slick grass, their breaths mingling in the cool air, each exhale a testament to survival, their bond forged in danger, glowing like embers ready to catch fire. The ranch, its barns weathered but sturdy, its windmill creaking like an old lullaby, stood as a haven reborn, its silence alive with possibility mirroring the shift in their hearts. Jasper's broad frame, taut from the night's peril, moved with purpose, his calloused hands unlatching the gate, his eyes scanning the horizon, not for threats but for a future he could scarcely imagine. Matoaka walked beside him, her lean form steady, her torn dress replaced by Jasper's shirt sleeves rolled to her elbows, her dark hair catching light like a raven's wing, her eyes sharp, yet softened like a blade sheathed after battle, her spirit fierce, yet finding rest in this fragile peace. Weeks wove a tapestry of labor and healing, as Matoaka's hands, once clenched in defiance, turned the earth, planting corn and beans in a garden that bloomed like a hymn against the barren plains. Her fingers deft coaxing life from soil, her face glowing with sweat and purpose, a warrior remade into a creator. Jasper worked beside her, his shoulders heaving as he hauled water, his voice low, teaching her to mend harnesses, his rare laugh warm like sunlight through storm clouds when she outworked him. Her strength, a quiet challenge that stirred his heart, like a colt finding its legs. She taught him Apache star names, Weachon, Yi Wei, for the brightest rolling off her tongue like a prayer. And he listened, his hands pausing over a fence post, his eyes tracing her face where bruises had faded, leaving sharp lines of resolve like a canyon carved by time. Evenings on the porch under a lantern's golden glow were silent but heavy, like a river carrying secrets, their glances weaving a bond stronger than words. Matoaka's courage drew others, her spirit a beacon, lighting the ranch like a flame in the dark as Apache children visited their laughter, ringing like bells clutching slates as she taught them to write, her voice firm yet patient, her eyes alight with purpose bridging worlds torn by hate. Jasper watched, his heart swelling like a tide, his hands idle, his face softening as he saw her as a leader, her spirit soaring like a hawk freed. One evening, as the sky burned lavender, he sat at his scarred desk pulling out a leather-bound deed, its ink spelling the ranch's boundaries in a steady hand. He called her inside, his voice rough but warm like a banked fire, and handed her the deed, his fingers brushing hers heavy with intent. "This place lives because of you," he said, his eyes raw like a healed wound, scarred but strong. "It's yours." Matoaka's breath caught her fingers trembling as she traced the paper, her eyes glistening with a fire brighter than sorrow, like a star refusing to fade. "You don't own me," she said, her voice a river finding its course, "but you gave me this." Jasper shook his head, throat-tight hands on the table. calluses a map of his journey. "You gave me more," he said, words heavy as stone eyes tracing her face where pride and pain mingled like sunset colors. "A reason to keep going." She nodded her hand on his, not gratitude but partnership fingers entwined like roots. Their silence a vow needing no words, a bond of choice, not chains. Under a full moon, bright as a silver dollar, Jasper built a fire in the yard, flames leaping like freed spirits, cedar logs crackling a song of release. He held the tattered bill of sale, Matoaka's name misspelled, and fed it to the fire, watching it curl, resisting, as if it knew its power was gone. Ashes rose like ghosts, and Jasper felt a weight lift his heart. Light, his past burned away, leaving the man he'd become beside her. Matoaka stood close, firelight bathing her face, eyes reflecting flames, her body still but alive, like a tree reaching for the sky. "Free," she whispered, fierce and soft a word, carrying 1,000 battles, her hand finding his fingers, locking a promise they'd chosen each other as equals bound by love. Their wedding came in spring, the garden Matoaka planted, bursting with wildflowers, a riot of life, the air sweet with bloomed children she taught, gathered close laughter, dancing with the breeze. Jasper stood beside her denim shirt, pressed hat in hands, eyes soft as dawn, whispering, "Welcome, Mrs. Stone," sealing their home. Matoaka's laugh broke free bright as sunlight piercing clouds her face, alight, hands steady in the green dress he'd given its embroidery a map of their journey. If this tale of redemption and love grips you, comment one below and join Western Stories and Wild West Stories where the frontier's heart beats with courage and connection.